I think you've discovered already that you can't read the book of Lamentations without being affected by it in one way or another. It leaves a taste in your mouth. And if I can return to my analogy of bitter chocolate, it's an acquired taste, but it does need to be taken perhaps in small doses, because too much at once can be quite a mouthful. We're going to turn to chapter 3, and without further ado, I'm going to read the first part of the chapter and let this scripture speak for itself. It's an interesting chapter, and there are a couple of things I want to say about it. I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. He has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Indeed, he has turned his hand against me again and again, all day long. He has made my skin and my flesh grow old, and has broken my bones. He has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and hardship. He has made me dwell in darkness, like those long dead. He has walled me in so that I cannot escape. He has weighed me down with chains. Even when I call out or cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has barred my way with blocks of stone. He has made my paths crooked. Like a bear lying in wait, like a lion in hiding, he dragged me from the path and mangled me and left me without help. He drew his bow and made me the target for his arrows. He pierced my heart with arrows from his quiver. I became the laughing stock of all my people. They mock me in song all day long. He has filled me with bitter herbs and sated me with gall. He has broken my teeth with gravel. He has trampled me in the dust. I have been deprived of peace. I have forgotten what prosperity is. So I say my splendor is gone, for all that I had hoped for from the Lord. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them. My soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. Last time we were dealing with two main themes. One was the grief of the nation. This terrible event had happened. It's a point in history. We can verify it. The year was 587 BC, when the armies of Babylon broke through the city wall of Jerusalem, sacked the city, destroyed so much of the life of the city, including the temple, and carted away a lot of the residents, particularly the more influential residents, into exile in Babylon. They were going to be there, as things turned out, 70 years. So with life expectancy being a little shorter then than it is now, many of them would not see their beloved land again. It was over and done with to all intents and purposes. The first two chapters are acrostic poems lamenting on this very traumatic experience. But it's not just a study in the grief of the people. The peculiar teaching of chapter 2, or I say peculiar, it's there in the other chapters, but it comes really into focus in the second chapter, is this strange understanding of what's happened. That it's not happened by chance or by accident, it's not one of those awful coincidences of life, but it's something that's actually happened by the direct intervention of God. It's as if God has turned against his people. And not once in that second chapter does the writer suggest that God is being unfair. He, in fact, upholds the justice of God. God seems to have done the right thing. The people have broken the terms of the covenant. God had promised them blessing if they kept the covenant. He promised them ill fortune if they'd broken it. They'd broken it, so this is what happened. These were the consequences of their misdeeds. There are two very subtle differences that I want you to notice. The first is that the third chapter is different in structure. Now, if you're following in your Bible, you will see that every other chapter in Lamentations has 22 verses. This one has 66 verses. But that in itself is a little bit deceptive. It's not that this chapter is 3 times as long as the other 4. It's simply that the structure of this chapter is different. It's still an acrostic poem working through the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, but instead of 22 verses as we got in chapters 1, 2, 4 and 5, now we've got 22 stanzas of 3 verses each. It's still an acrostic, but if you look at it in the original text, you will see that the first 3 verses of our English translation are the letter Aleph. The second 3 verses, that takes us up to verse 6, are the letter Beth. So you've got a structure that has become much more intense. From a human point of view, it must have taken an awful lot of effort to have arranged it in this way. One of the things we suggested last week was that we perhaps tried our hand at acrostics ourselves. Maybe a little later on we can share some of the things we've thought through on that theme. Don't worry if you haven't, but if you have, we'd like to hear them. But what you've got in the third chapter is an intensification of this poetic theme. The writer now must be making an awful lot of effort to keep this up. One of the things that I wonder is the structure of grief a help or a hindrance? You see, in a sense, we've all got structures for coping with trauma and grief, haven't we? And the book of Lamentations is probably giving us a little hint that a structure isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a framework in which we can express some of our feelings. When we go through experiences of grief, whether it's through bereavement or the breakup of a relationship, or perhaps very topically today, the loss of a job or a source of income, we can go through all kinds of irrational things. Is the writer of Lamentations giving us a little hint that sometimes a structure for our grief can be a helpful thing? Now, those of you who, like me, are a little bit long in the tooth when it comes to Christian ministry will know that the structures of grief have changed an awful lot over the last 30 or 40 years. Some of us, when we began our ministry, would have conducted funerals in quite a different way from the way perhaps we would conduct them today. In some respects, funeral services have become much more personalised. It's entirely proper and appropriate today for members of the bereaved family to get up and speak and say a few words. Doesn't have to be that way, but sometimes that's the appropriate thing to do. One of the little things I've always borne in mind is that some people can do that more easily than others. And I've always said to people, don't feel you have to, because sometimes that can be quite a distraction. But there are other things that have changed as well. I can just remember when policemen would stand to attention when a funeral service went by. Don't know whether that's done in some rural parts, but it certainly was in my hometown 45, 50 years ago. But having lived for over 25 years on Earlham Road in Norwich, not far from the city crematorium, funeral services could go by all through the day and people wouldn't bat an eye. It was almost as if society had lost that dimension of corporate grief. It's hard to grieve when the person in the coffin is a complete stranger. So what? But actually, it can be helpful to have some sort of structure. And I've heard people say, and I'm inclined to believe them, that one of the things today is that life seems to get back to normal so quickly that people don't always have the space and the framework in which to grieve. I can't remember the last time I saw someone wearing a black armband at a funeral service. And I hope that when I die, people don't come wearing black. I hope it's quite a lively affair. I love colour and I love diversity. And those things in our culture are reflected in funeral services today. Not sure I could ever get to the point where I went to a funeral service in a t-shirt and jeans, but is a structure for grief a help or a hindrance? I'd be interested in your thoughts there. But this chapter is not just different from the others in the structure, but it's different in the substance. And of course, when you get halfway through the chapter, it's almost as if you enter into a new world. The writer has been wallowing in his grief. My splendour is gone and all that I had hoped for from the Lord. Verse 19, I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them and my soul is downcast within me. But look at verse 21. Out of the blue. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Now, we've not heard a lot about hope in this book so far, have we? We've actually had to wait till we get halfway through before there's a glimmer of hope. But the hope gets better in verse 22. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Now, I've always found it strange that one of the loveliest of Christian hymns comes from arguably the most miserable book in the Bible. It's there as a bright shining star on a dark night. What does that say about hope? To me, it suggests that hope doesn't always come readily and easily. Sometimes it's something we have to wait for. Sometimes perhaps it's something we have to wrestle for. I don't know. I'd be very interested in your thoughts. Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee. Isn't it amazing how that great hymn resonates with us? It was one of the hymns that we sang on Sunday morning for our Methodist home Sunday. It's the hymn with which we ended our service. We tuned in to Ros's telephone service on Sunday afternoon and have a guess what the last hymn was. Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. One of my old friends at Folsham was a farmer, and he loves the verse, summer and winter, and springtime and harvest, sun, moon and stars in their courses above. I tried to find a little bit out about Thomas Chisholm, who wrote it. I can't find any details of the circumstances in which the hymn was written. Perhaps you can help me on that. If not now, maybe later. But this is quite different from anything else we've had in Lamentations so far. And one of the things that we need to point out is that in Hebrew poetry, the best bit is always the bit that comes in the middle. Now, in most poetry today, we work up to a climax that comes at the end, don't we? in Hebrew poetry, the climax was like the summit of a mountain. And then suddenly that hope comes into view. I would love to think that the book stopped there. But I just tell you that chapter 4 is even worse than chapters 1 and 2. But I'm not going to inflict that on you just at the moment. But this is the mountaintop. This is the pinnacle. This is the high point. And it's not necessarily saying that hope disappears as quickly as it appears. This hope breaks out into view. Wonderful words that resonate with our hearts. It disappears, but the poet is not necessarily implying that hope is something that goes as quickly as it comes or is ephemeral. Yes, the book is going to run its course, and there are one or two other things that we got in store for us before we breathe a sigh of relief and say, with a pat on each other's back, we've done Lamentations, but not just yet. We're at the top of the mountain. Let's pause and enjoy it. Now, if you've got the workbooks, you've got one or two very interesting questions. If you haven't, I'm just going to read one or two that have really struck me, and perhaps you'd like to work a way around them. The first is this. Suffering seems to inspire great art and literature. Do you agree? Disagree? Why and why not? I have to say, I'm not a fan of Benjamin Britten's music. Time and time again, I felt guilty for not enjoying it. I've tried to appreciate it, particularly as he was a Suffolk lad and went to school in Norfolk. But the other night, just by accident, I happened to flip onto a programme that was an early recording of Benjamin Britten's War Requiem. It's the traditional words of the Latin Mass for the dead, interspersed with the poems of Wilfred Owen, one of the First World War poets. And I'm not going to say this too loudly, because I'm not going to rush out and buy the CD, but I found it intensely moving. Benjamin Britten, as you remember possibly, wrote the War Requiem for the consecration of the new Coventry Cathedral, the building that was raised from the ashes of the building that was so badly damaged in the Blitz. Do you think that suffering can inspire great art and literature? How does the context of these verses in the middle of the chapter, the pinnacle, the peak of the chapter, change your perspective on the well-loved lines of the hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness?